Human experience is no stranger to grief, loss, death, and dying. Across cultures, ancient and modern, each challenge to health and wholeness has created a language to react to these assaults on life and its meaning. In today's global pandemic, the experiences of loneliness and lockdown we feel include the longing to hold and be held, the cry for healing, and the need to know each death is more than a mere statistic. And poetry, a voice from the heart of humanity, is our spirit-filled way to respond. In this virtual talk, led by Donald L. Rogan, Professor of Religious Studies Emeritus, Royal Rhodes, we will hear a few poems from the past and present and discuss creative options for connecting during these dry days of disconnection. Thank you, Royal.
Thank you so much, and good evening, friends. I want to especially thank Kim Wallace and Annie Gordon for making this possible. Those of you who know me know that I am totally technologically challenged, and I don't even measure up to junior varsity Amish. So thank you to Kim and Annie for putting this together. Let's look at the first image. Before I talk about it, I just want to mention some of the reasons I think poetry is such a powerful way for people historically and today to respond to the terror, the fear of the distress of disease and death and dying. For me, poetry inhabits what I call the mystery of the small and the enclosed, a pause between uncertainties, erasing the borders of past, present, and future, facing the unknown as we are now, a way to be totally present to each other and to the words crafted, our way of co-creating our world together, like a spiritual practice of attention to what is overlooked or disregarded, to what is confusing and terrifying. Poems are, for me, and I think for so many of you listening in, the voice from the heart of life. This is an image from a Grecian urn. I won't recite the ode on a Grecian urn, but this shows the god Apollo firing his arrows of death into the Achaeans, the Greeks, who had desecrated his shrine. I'm going to read a passage from the first book of the Iliad, translated by Alexander Pope, about this occurrence. So the priest spoke in prayer, and Phoebus Apollo heard him. Down from the peaks of Olympus he strode, angered at heart, bearing on his shoulders his bow and covered quiver. The arrows rattled on the shoulders of the angry god as he moved, and his coming was like the night. Then he sat down apart from the ships and let fly an arrow. Terrible was the twang of his silver bow. The mules he assailed first, and the swift dogs. But then on the men themselves, he let fly his stinging shafts and struck. And constantly the pyres of the dead burned thick. For 9 days, the missiles of the god ranged among the host. This passage is typical of many of the ancient poems we have dealing with plague, pandemic, disease, and death. Think of the opening act of the Greek play, Greek tragedy, Oedipus, where the elders and citizens of Thebes climb up onto the Acropolis seeking the help of the king, Oedipus, because surely the leader of the country would know what was happening and would be able to help them. Think also about that passage from the Hebrew Bible, the book of Genesis, where the 10 plagues are visited upon the Egyptians for the way that they have treated the slaves, those Hebrews who they have kept in slavery for many years. Those are often the poems we have in the West about causes for pandemic or plague. There has been some offense made to the gods, and the gods' wrath is visited. Another ancient poem, this time from the Roman poet Lucretius, is taken from his great work, De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. He translates into Latin his version of the description given by Thucydides of the Great Plague of Athens, a plague that disrupted Athenian politics and economics and military might, and finally resulted in the demise of Athenian democracy. But Lucretius didn't believe that the plague was caused by the gods. Lucretius believed in the gods. He just didn't think that the gods had any use or interest in humans. It was how humans reacted to the natural world, how humans had used nature that precipitated the plague. So here's a portion of that from book 6 of On the Nature of Things by Lucretius. And this is my translation, forgive me. The torment denied any respite. Bodies wore out. Even medicine mumbled in a hush its fear, haunted by victims rolling their round eyes, unvisited by sleep, staring straight at death. They gave many other signs of impending death, a mind deranged and melancholy with dread, a frowning brow, an angry and fierce countenance, ears throbbing with constant ringing noises, thick breathing, ragged gasps deep in the throat, a neck glistening with copious, soaking sweat, spittle, thin, scanty, flecked yellow and salty, hacked up by a rough cough from a rattling throat. The tendons in the hands did not stop constricting, the shakes, as a slow chill creeps up from the toes. At the supreme moment, with pinched nostrils, see the sharp point of the nose's tip, eyes sunk, the temples hollowed, the skin cold and rough, a taut grimace on the mouth, the forehead stretched. Not long after this, the limbs stiffen in death, perhaps by the light of the 8th day, or on the 9th, the torch of life blew out. Let's go to the image from the Middle Ages. This is the great painting by Bruegel, showing a world of death ruled by demons and skeletons and the many dead. In the liturgical life of the Christian church of that time, down to the present day, when the Mass for the dead was offered, the great 14th century poem by Jacopone da Todi, the Dies Irae, is recited. Some of you may know it from the great work of Verdi in the 19th century, his Requiem, or from Berlioz in the 19th century, his Requiem. I won't try to sing it. You'll be happy to know. But here are some sections in my translation of the Latin. Dies irae, dies illa, sol et saeculum in favilla, teste David cum Sibylla. Day of wrath, that dreaded day, when the world in ashes lay, as David and the Sibyl say. Tuba mirum spagens sonum, per sepulchra regionum, cogit omnes ante thronum. Hear the wondrous trumpets blast, from the nether realm broadcast. We're forced before the throne at last. The Black Death appears in Sicily in 1347. Here is an image of the coming of the Black Death to Florence. Some people think that Black Death is really a mistranslation of what was said as the vast death, because by 1348-49, a third of Italy had died. Think about our own experience today with the pandemic and the large casualty numbers from Italy. And by that time, 60% of the population of Europe had died. Worldwide estimates are anywhere between 40 and 60 million people died. In Siena alone, 30 to 50% of the population died from the plague, with unspeakable impact on the culture, political life, economic life, and religious life of the people, and the art. Think about the way in which Renaissance art encapsulates images of death and dying, skulls and skeletons. There were two waves. First, the pneumonic wave, and people who contracted the Black Death and had a pneumonic experience with it usually lasted 3 days. Another wave came with blood bulges, the so-called buboes. And those people lasted perhaps for 5 days. Pits had to be dug for the corpses. There were no ways for people to have the typical religious rites or burials. The poor were forced to dig those graves because they were considered essential workers. And they worked burying the dead until they themselves died. Our term quarantine comes from this ancient time, means 40 days. People who were believed to have the plague sometimes were walled into their own houses and left to die. People were banned from returning to their homes if they had visited infected areas. How many of us have been asked if we traveled out of the country or the state recently? And the wealthy fled. In the 1340s, Boccaccio, the great writer, wrote about 10 wealthy young people, 7 young women and 3 young men who fled the plague in Florence, fled into the hills to a villa in Fiesole. And there, to entertain themselves, they told stories and feasted and played. So his Decameron is the record of what he says were the 100 stories that they told each other and had discussions about for the 2 weeks that they were in isolation or lockdown in Fiesole. Tales that were elegiac, epic, and often erotic. They were living in a bubble away from the cares of the world, talking about great thoughts and literature and poetry. It seems kind of familiar to me for some reason. In the later period, we can see an image from England. And this shows the way in which in the 16th century and 17th century, the various plagues affected people then. Here is the classic ringing of the bell and bring out your dead. Those of us who are fans of Monty Python probably remember a comic twist on this. But Monty Python writers always did their homework. They knew what the past was like. This is a poem by John Davies called The Triumph of Death that he wrote in the 1590s about a plague that had broken out in London. Now London smokes with vapors that arise. From his foul sweat himself he so bestirs. Cast out your dead, the carcass carrier cries, which he by heaps in groundless graves interres. Now like to bees in summer's heat from hives, out fly the citizens, some here, some there, some all alone, and others with their wives, with wives and children, some fly, all for fear. Here stands a watch with guard of partisans to stop their passage, or to or fro, as if they were not men, not Christians, but fiends or monsters, murdering as they go. The history of the modern world from the late Middle Ages, early modern period to our own day is in fact a history of plagues and pandemics. Smallpox, cholera, typhus, polio. I remember as a child taking the first doses of anti-polio medicine. Malaria, SARS, MERS, H1N1, the seasonal flu, swine flu, Legionnaire's disease, and one that many people probably don't know of in America, schistosomiasis, snail fever. Literary works like Edgar Allan Poe's Masque of the Red Death, Manzoni's great novel, The Betrothed, about plague in 17th century North Italy, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Love in a Time of Cholera, are some of the literary responses and ideas about plague, pandemic, and death. We see from these ancient times into the modern period continuing themes of denial, distrust, claims of fake news, conspiracy theories, deserted streets and stores, empty assembly halls and schools and churches, lockdowns, escapes to safe zones. We're looking for a new normal away from restrictions, repressions, deprivations, regulations. But I think in the last few months, we have come to realize something else, that all of these things have been the old normal for billions of Black and brown people around the world. A world of natural and man-made disasters, refugee camps, wars, untreated diseases, ethnic cleansing, endemic poverty. All of those things were the normal for so many of our fellow humans. Another modern pandemic was, of course, AIDS. And here we see an image of one of the terrible times during the AIDS crisis. And so many poets have commented about AIDS and the friends, family members, and others who they lost. People like Tom Gunn's great poems in his collection, The Man with the Night Sweats, or Dr. Rafael Campo's poetry, or this short poem on AIDS by Tim Dlugos. It's thought to be the first poem written about AIDS. It's called My Death. When I no longer feel it breathing down my neck, it's just around the corner. Hi, neighbor. Let's go back to the image of the flu pandemic of 1918. This, as we now know, began at Camp Funston in Kansas, was carried by the US military to Europe, where it became heightened, metastasized, we could say, and then was returned to the United States with the returning troops. And so attempts were made to try to keep people masked and socially distanced. And many people refused to do it because they said that it was an impingement on their rights. But it was the only method people had to try to control things. It was called the Spanish flu because Spain was neutral in the First World War.
Yeah.
And the nations that were at war didn't want to talk about epidemics or deaths from the flu because they were afraid it would affect morale or their ability to fight. I have a personal connection to the 1918 pandemic. I had an uncle who, as an infant, had both of his parents die within 72 hours of each other. And he was sent by train as a baby to a different state to be raised by cousins. I had another aunt and uncle who lost 2 sets of twins to the flu. It still is a major source of death for our country and for the world. The other, I look at my notes for a second. Another way in which the pandemic has affected us is in our vocabulary. Words like lockdown have been introduced. And the poem Lockdown by Simon Armitage, the former poet laureate of England, will be read to us by Lars Hansen, who's an alumnus, class of '86, and also a Yale MFA holder. He was a drama major here and who took a number of classes in the religion department. Lars said to me to please note that themes and ideas explored in my classes still resonate, especially the phrase mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the numinous. So here is Lars Hansen reading Armitage's poem.
Lockdown by Simon Armitage. And I couldn't escape the waking dream of infected fleas and the warp and weft of soggy cloth by the tailor's hearth in ye olde Eam. Then couldn't unsee the boundary stone, that cockeyed dice with its 6 dark holes, thimbles brimming with vinegar wine, purging the plagued coins. which brought to mind the sorry story of Emmett Siddle and Roland Torrey, star-crossed lovers on either side of the quarantine line, whose wordless courtship spanned the river till she came no longer. But slept again, and dreamt this time of the exiled Yaksha sending word to his lost wife on a passing cloud, a cloud that followed an earthly map of camel trails and cattle tracks, streams like necklaces, fan-tailed peacocks, painted elephants, embroidered bedspreads of meadows and hedges, bamboo forests and snow-hatted peaks, waterfalls, creeks, the hieroglyphs of wide-winged cranes, and the glistening lotus flower after rain. The air, hypnotically see-through, rare. The journey a ponderous one at times, long and slow, but necessarily so.
Thank you, Lars. We've also been witness to attempts to get people outside more, to take walks, explore the outdoors. Poems show when we feel most fragile, vulnerable, disempowered, and lost, nature brings real evidence of resilience, speaking truths about the wonder of existence we share with the natural world. This is a poem by Wendell Berry called A Piece of Wild Things. It'll be read by Kathleen Duffy, a recent graduate of Kenyon, who majored in religious studies and who is now in a PhD program at the University of Chicago studying Asian religions. So here is Kathleen.
The Piece of Wild Things by Wendell Berry. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free.
Thank you, Kathleen. We also see in the modern responses to the pandemic the use of images of various kinds that have been around for a long time and which have returned. So here's an image, again from England in the 17th century, that shows the so-called dance of death, the danse macabre. Another image in the modern period based on that is taken from Ingmar Bergman's great film, The Seventh Seal. Some of you have remembered. And this is the closing image of that film, turned into a parody for those of you who have seen Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, but a way for humor to be able to try to control the dread and fear that we have. Hospitals and medical centers in the modern period have themselves become sources of fear and anxiety. I know visiting the local hospital recently, even though masked and attempting to be distanced from people, there was still that fear. Here we have an image of a 17th century doctor with a classic beak mask. This is 17th century, and it was actually created for the court of of Louis XIV. And in that beak would be flowers and other sweet smelling things as the doctor dealt with the horrors of the smells of death and decay. But it may be a stylish alternative for us in the modern period to use as well. This is a poem I wrote about visiting a hospital. It's going to be published on Sunday in an international online journal. Waiting in the hospital parking lot. On this fall spring day, the off-green embankment I no longer can mount without huffing and puffing like a lung-damaged wolf trying to blow down a brick apartment house. A rise of manicured turf displays on its muddy crest the spindly black limbs of rigid trees, leafless against a solid cloud bank of sky that never ends. As I try to enter the hospital and half expect the spectral chorus line of a Totentanz from Bergman's Seventh Seal to traipse across the horizon, the last dancer extending a still warm beckoning hand on mine at the locked door with its cold steel handle. The glass reflects my fear, but I still extend my hand. The modern period has also given us a sense of hope. And this is a poem by Emily Dickinson that will be read by Emma Mead Mello, an alumna of the class of 1995 who lives in Louisville, Kentucky, and teaches youngsters the wonder and magic of art and creative play. Emily Dickinson's poem, Hope is a Thing with Feathers.
Hope is the Thing with Feathers by Emily Dickinson. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me.
Thank you, Emma. The last image is another alumna of Kenyon, Dr. Camila Odio, who is an epidemiologist at Yale New Haven Hospital and Medical School, who is working with her team on finding a vaccine and treatments for coronavirus. This is an image for me of hope. And I'll end by reading this poem by the great contemporary Irish poet, Derek Mahan. When I look at this picture, I think of this poem. Everything is going to be all right. How should I not be glad to contemplate the clouds clearing beyond the dormer window and a high tide reflected on the ceiling? There will be dying. There will be dying. But there is no need to go into that. The poems flow from the hand unbidden, and the hidden source is the watchful heart. The sun rises in spite of everything, and the far cities are beautiful and bright. I lie here in a riot of sunlight, watching the daybreak and the clouds flying. Everything is going to be all right. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Rhodes. If there are any folks who have questions, it doesn't look like anyone sent any through to the chat, but you're more than welcome to send them to the chat, or we can also take folks for audible questions if you just want to use the raise your hand function reaction.
I just want to thank you all for tuning in and for listening. And I would hope that all of you will be finding poems and literature and art and discussions, safely distanced, from family and friends that will keep your courage and your sense of the beauty of life and happiness going.
We had one question come through in the chat. Someone asked, what was the name of the final poem that you read?
The final poem by Derek Mahan, M-A-H-O-N, is called Everything is Going to Be All Right. He's a great poet. I encourage you to read him. And I especially want to thank all of the alums who read, Lars Hansen, one of my oldest friends, and Kathleen Duffy, one of my newest friends, and Emma Mello, who is also my goddaughter and light of my life. Thank you for all of these wonderful things people are saying.
Professor Rhodes, I think there's another question in the chat that says, are there any comparisons between World War I trenches poetry and today?
Yes, I think the great poets Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owens, Robert Graves, was it E.F. Thomas? We're talking about what was endured by those who are actually facing the death and devastation as cannon fodder in that terrible conflagration. And they didn't talk so much about disease. They weren't allowed to. But that was just as devastating for it. Although we have to remember that with World War I was the first time that more people died from actual combat than from disease in the history of warfare. I'd encourage you to look at some of that great World War I poetry and also the great music and artwork. They were also dealing with the tradition of the glorification of death for God and for country. God is on our side, and so I think in the modern period there are real differences about how people see their relationship to the source of meaning and life in the world. Someone asked if I've been working on some other poetry. I have. I'm indebted to the college for giving me a study space and a computer to use. And I've been in collaboration with Claudia Esslinger in the studio art department. She took a set of fabulous photographs of churches in Italy during a year there with the Kenyan in Rome program. And she digitally manipulated those panoramas, and I wrote a poem for 20 of those images, and we're just putting the finishing touches to that. I've also been with a a group of student curators at the Gund Gallery who are part of a group doing a year-long series on the art of the tree. I've done about 17 poems with them, and there'll be exhibitions and other events related to that beginning this month and then into the spring semester. So stay tuned. So good to see these faces.
Right.
In this time of anxiety, we need to reach out to each other. Someone asked, what should we be doing? I suggested, and Kim Wallace very nicely put together a group of Kenyan alumni who are in ministry, Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish, who recorded short messages of encouragement. I think those must be available to everyone. But I think we need to keep in touch as best we can, whatever way we can, with those we love. And I had a cousin who 2 days ago had a baby boy, and it'll be some time before I can see him. But keeping in touch with the family through calls and email and Zoom as he comes into this world. And I wonder about the little ones, what they're going to make of this in the years ahead. I think there's going to be a recording made. Is that correct, Kim? People are asking if they, since they missed part of it, will they be able to see the whole thing?
Yes, we will email the link to everyone who registered for this event, and then we will also post it on the alumni events webpage for those who didn't register who also would like to listen. And I see someone in the chat asked, where's the clergy link? I believe it was on our website, but as you may or may not know, Kenyon just released a new website, and so some things didn't migrate over. So I'll double check and make sure if it isn't on there that it is added to the alumni events page where there is a list of recordings at the bottom.
Someone suggests that there be more poetry Zooms. I'm all for that. I would like to be in your place listening to the great student and faculty and visitor poets that Kenyon is famous for. I was fortunate in graduate school to sit in on some classes taught by Robert Lowell and Peter Taylor, who were friends and roommates at Kenyon, and talked about a very strange place out in the Midwest called Kenyon College. So as I've said to students over the years, the language spoken at Kenyon is poetry, not prose.
Okay.
Royal Don Rogan would be very pleased at tonight's presentation.
Thank you so much. Don was an inspiration, a great lover of poetry, who entertained Seamus Heaney in his home, amongst many other poets, Jory Graham, and the list went on. He and Sally Rogan were great advocates and promoters of poetry at Kenyon.